When a commitment-phobic woman puts on a magical bridal veil, it takes her to a time when she is married and has 2 children. In the opening scene, we are taken into the emergency center where Natalie is taking care of a small girl named Haley. To brighten up her mood, Natalie hands the little girl 2 sweets before letting her rest. Her colleague lets her know that she's going to be a great doctor one day, but it seems like something is on Natalie's mind. She admits being scared about the finals as she's conflicted about what career path to choose. Luckily, her boyfriend, a doctor at the hospital, brings her a cup of coffee to cheer her up. He's being affectionate, but Natalie stops him from kissing her so the people don't talk. He suggests they have dinner, and even though Natalie tries to decline at first, she later agrees. Scott asks her to show him the list of pros and cons at dinner, knowing that she for sure has made a list already. As they get closer to the entrance door, Natalie manages to steal a kiss from Scott before continuing with work. Scott stands in awe of his girlfriend when a colleague approaches him. She thinks that he's a lucky man, but he admits to being scared that Natalie might choose her career over him someday and move far. Returning home from work late, Natalie is greeted by her family as she apologizes for being late. Her mother tries to fix her up a plate, but she lets them know that she'll be having dinner with Scott. Her sister's face drops and disappointment can be noticed on her face as he excuses herself to go to her room. Natalie notices that something's wrong, and her mother tells her that she should talk to her sister as she had been looking forward to having dinner with her. Knocking on her sister's bedroom door, Natalie lets herself in and asks if she can borrow some clothes for dinner. They go through her sister's clothes as they make small talk. Surprised to hear that her sister has broken up with her boyfriend 3 months ago, Natalie asks why she hadn't told her sooner. Abby lets her know that she didn't want to bother her during the exams, and that is why she didn't tell her anything. The older sister assures her that she can tell her everything, so Abby admits to being scared that she'll never find love like Natalie and Scott's. Asking whether Scott's going to propose soon, Abby hopes that Natalie will say yes. She declines, but she doesn't know what's waiting for her hours ahead. She admits to loving him and everything about him, but they're simply not ready yet. The perfect dress is finally found, and as Natalie's about to leave to get dressed, Abby asks her if she can come to her school on career day. Unfortunately, Natalie has to reject her sister once again, and even though her sister is visibly upset, she understands that Natalie is busy with school. The smell of fresh cookies fills the house as Natalie gets ready for her date. Being late as usual, Scott finally arrives, taking a couple of cookies from the tray that he's only allowed to take from, and taking Natalie with him. They walk to a beautiful park where they set up their picnic and enjoy their delicious food. Natalie apologizes for being anxious as she admits that her mind is racing due to the residency she has to choose. Wanting to help his girlfriend, he asks her to find out at that moment. Working with children is something, and geriatrics is something that she loves, but her main focus is to help people as she feels good doing so. He suggests surgery, but there isn't enough patient interaction for her. Staring at her with love, Scott lets her know that the fact that she only wants to help people is something he loves the most about her. Assuring her that he isn't worried about the future and can't see one without her in it, he gets on one knee and asks her to marry him. Staring at him in disbelief, she declines his offer as she can't marry him when there's too much uncertainty in their relationship. Baffled, he asks her why she doesn't want to marry him, and she struggles to find the answer. He leaves in disbelief as she sits alone rethinking her decision. The next morning is awkward for them as their coworker congratulates them on the proposal, but she doesn't know that Natalie had declined. They go out to have a private chat where Scott tells her that he's gotten a call from a residency in Chicago that requires a 3-year contract minimum. Surprised to hear that he'll be leaving the following day, struggling to find the words, Natalie doesn't say anything, which doesn't leave Scott with much choice. He tries to leave, but she stops him, only not to say anything once again. Not wanting to go to her parents because they love Scott, Natalie heads to her grandmother's for some advice. Noticing how upset her grandchild is, Mimi lets Natalie in immediately and makes sure to listen to her problems. Natalie admits that she doesn't know what she wants and feels like everything's falling apart. She wishes she knew where she's supposed to go, and that gives Mimi a great idea. Entering the storage room, Mimi goes to the back and pulls out her wedding veil. Looking at the beautifully made veil, she admits to being so nervous on her wedding day that she almost didn't make it down the aisle. Marrying her husband was the best decision she ever made, but she admits to being unsure about the marriage at first. However, once she put on that veil, she had a feeling of certainty that she was doing the right thing. What she saw after putting the veil on was a future she loved, and that's why it helped her decide. Mimi asks Natalie to put the veil on, and even though she's skeptical at first, she tries it on either way. The moment she puts the veil on, she loses consciousness and wakes up in front of a mirror as Scott comes behind her. He kisses her on the cheek while complimenting her scarf, saying that it reminds him of their honeymoon. Thinking that she's seen it all, she becomes baffled when 2 children come running to her asking for pancakes while calling her mommy. Overwhelmed by the whole situation, Natalie faints as she falls on her head. Waking up and seeing Scott's in front of her, she thinks it's all a dream until she sees her 2 children by her side. Scott thinks that she's experiencing some sort of concussion, so he tries to call the doctor, but Natalie stops him. Looking around, she realizes that they're in Mimi's house, so she asks where she is. Finding out that Mimi had moved out confuses her even more. She stands up, and even though Scott tries to stop her, she assures him that she only needs a power nap. Grabbing her phone, she tries to find her friend's number when her daughter asks if she's pregnant. Letting them know that she's not, she goes upstairs to call her colleague. Her colleague is surprised to hear from her as she lets her know that it has been 10 years since she contacted her. Trying to confide in her friend, Natalie lets her know that she's not sure everything's alright, but the nurse tells her to call 911 if she's experiencing medical emergencies. Retracing her steps, Natalie finally remembers the veil, so she runs to the storage room to find it. Trying it on, she hopes to go back to normal, but the veil doesn't work. Her mother enters the room and sees that she's visibly upset. Natalie explains the situation, but her mother doesn't understand, as she thinks that Natalie's only upset about time flying, and that she's overwhelmed about it. Knowing that Mimi is the only one that can answer her question, she plans to find her, but her mother lets her know that she'll be seeing her at the fitting. In the salon, she gets overwhelmed by seeing her little sister Abby in a wedding dress, so she can't control her tears. Abby asks for the veil, but Natalie lies about forgetting it. Not wanting to let the stress get to her, Abby assures her that everything is fine while thanking her for everything she's done. She goes to take the dress off, and her mother joins to help her, so Natalie takes the opportunity to ask Mimi about the veil. Surprisingly, Natalie has to wait until all is revealed to go back to the way everything was, and even though she's concerned about her residencies, she decides to wait patiently until all is over. Later in the evening, Scott decides to relax with Natalie at the restaurant they used to go to in college. She is surprised that everything's the same even 10 years later, and the fact that they still order the same thing every time. Scott reminds her that their first date had been there, and they laugh about how bizarre it was. To make matters more interesting, Natalie suggests they do a do-over as she shakes his hand, introducing herself. She asks him what he likes to do for fun, and he says that he usually has date nights, movie nights, and even dancing in the kitchen. Thinking that it's rather boring what he does for fun, she asks him why he enjoys those things. He loves them because they get to do what they love, which is helping people while having a home filled with laughter. On their way back, they walk along the sidewalk when Natalie asks him whether he wishes to have waited to see what his career was going to do first. He reveals that he only follows his heart, but she's curious as to how he was sure that he made the right decision. He notices that a lot is going on in her mind, and she admits to feeling like she can never get ahead of things, and he chimes in saying no matter if she puts it in her spreadsheets. A smile forms on her face as she realizes that she still plans in her spreadsheet. 10 years later. The next day, Natalie catches Scott dancing as he's preparing dinner, and that sight brings a smile to her face. He sees her and immediately grabs her for a dance, stopping the whole show from continuing. Natalie tries to explain to him that she's not who he thinks she is, but same as her mother, he thinks that she's just overwhelmed by how fast time flies. Later in the evening, they get ready for bed when Scott reveals that their son Dylan has test anxiety. Realizing that it's the same problem she had as a kid, she yells at Scott that they should fix it as soon as possible. Given that they've already been through the issue many times, Scott lets her know that he doesn't want to fight, as he believes that Silan will eventually grow out of it. He asks Natalie to drop the kids off at school the following day before work, and Natalie is surprised to hear that she's working. Walking into the hospital the following morning, Rachel feels amazing as everyone refers to her as Doctor. Rachel, one of the nurses in the hospital, walks in and asks her why she hasn't left yet. Natalie realizes that it's Tuesday, which is date night for her, and Scott right when he calls her. Despite it being their unbreakable tradition, Natalie breaks it for the first time as she wants to finish the work she has left. Returning from her job late, she sees Scott and the kids in the living room as Scott prepares some supplies for Emma's project. Seeing his calm and control of the situation, Natalie decides to rest for a little while they work on the project, and before she dozes off, she checks with Scott whether everything's alright. A couple of hours later, she wakes up only to find Scott drinking wine on the terrace. Sitting next to him, she admits to screwing up that day, and he asks her to talk to him if something is going on. She admits to feeling like she's letting everybody down, and it bugs her a lot. Taking her hand in his, he reminds her that she's not alone and that whatever problem she has, they'll fix it together. The next day, Natalie and Abby do a cake taste test for the wedding, and Abby decides to have 2 flavors combined. The cake is not bothering Abby, but the fact that she wants to love like Natalie and Scott, and she fears that she might not find it. Natalie asks her not to think about it as she assures her that she has everything under control. After the testing, Natalie tries the veil to see if it works, and it doesn't, meaning that she has more to find out. Scott sees her trying the veil on and assumes that she's feeling nostalgic. Unsure of her feelings, she asks Scott if his life is what he always wanted, and he reveals that it's better than what he hoped for. Keeping the good news coming, he reveals that he had spoken to the school counselor, and that they'll be having a discussion with them about Dylan's anxiety. The following day, he decides to surprise his wife as he takes her to the place he proposed. Impatiently waiting with her eyes covered, Natalie decides to take the blindfold off only to see what she remembered to be disastrous. However, they end up having an amazing picnic as Scott starts shouting that he loves her and even makes her do it. As they're waiting for the council to come to the office, their anxieties are through the roof as they start saying to each other that the other one was right. Natalie lets him know that, no matter what mistake they make, he's a great dad and calls her a super good mom. The council finally comes in and gets to work immediately. She suggests they move Dylan to the front of the class, so Natalie and Scott agree that coming up with a game plan when he has a test could be beneficial as something that he can turn to when he begins to panic. Seems like Natalie is getting used to the life she can choose to have. The success in her work is her biggest motivator as she finds herself doing better than ever while helping people. Returning home, she is greeted by her kids and husband who are making dinner for her. After having dinner, Scott and Natalie wash the dishes together, and instead of breaking up their dance, Natalie can finally be seen enjoying their silly activities together. Changing the tune to something more romantic, they get closer to each other and share a passionate kiss. She's getting used to having kids as well, as she loves taking care of them and their little family, enjoying the simple things like brushing her daughter's hair or taking them to the park. Despite being occupied with work and the kids, they make sure to spend some time with each other, not letting the romance fade away. Getting the kids ready for school, Scott asks Dylan what he has to do when he gets anxious, and the little boy says that he has to eat it for breakfast. Enjoying a cup of coffee with Mimi, Natalie's asked how she's liking what she is seeing. Despite being tired and overwhelmed, she reveals that she likes what she's seeing and how good of a dad Scott is. Natalie's phone rings and it's Abby asking her if she's booked a hairdresser for her wedding. And of course Natalie lies that she has. Mimi assures her that she has a hair girl for her, but Natalie reveals that she had forgotten to book everything for the wedding. Mimi reminds her that there's nothing she can't solve without a spreadsheet, so she plans to make a list of birthdays and anniversaries which will help Natalie with the passwords. Everything else is Natalie's job. She complains about working that day, but Mimi lets her know that she booked the day off for her 2 weeks ago. Back at her house, she sits down ready to find the passwords, and after a couple of tries, she finally gets in. As she's looking through the spreadsheet, the doorbell rings and it is the hairdresser and Abby. Abby's hair is done, and just as they're about to put the veil on, Natalie's anxiety starts rising. She tries to stop them from putting the veil over her head, but they don't listen to her. Natalie can finally catch her breath after the veil is removed and nothing happens. After Abby is over, she sits down to have her hair done. As the lady finishes with the braiding, Abby can't help but stare at her sister in awe. Even Natalie is surprised to see herself look so beautiful, but Abby reminds her that she's always been a beautiful, amazing, and brilliant woman whom everyone sees as such. She takes the kids to a park next where they walk around feeding the ducks, telling them the story of how their father had taken her to the mountains to see the snow for the first time. She reveals that he had worked in the campus bookstore during the day so he could afford the trip. The kids agree that it's very characteristic of him to do that, and Natalie reveals that he's always been thoughtful and great at surprises. She takes the kids to the park next so they can play when her father phones her, asking why she hasn't brought them over yet. She remembers that it's Tuesday, but her father reminds her that she's supposed to have a double date with Abby and her fiancé. After dropping the kids off at their grandparents' house, she struggles to find the restaurant but arrives there at the end. Scott lets her know that there isn't a reservation at the restaurant, and Natalie assumes that she must have forgotten to put it in her spreadsheet. However, he reminds her that they've planned the double date for weeks. He decides to call up their doctor, thinking that she's acting weird because she is falling on her head, but she assures him that there's no need. Assuming the worst, he asks whether she's unhappy in their marriage, but she doesn't answer him as she asks him to head inside. Abby and her fiancé reveal that they asked them to have dinner together so they can help them write their vows. Scott advises them to think of the first time they fell in love, and Natalie thinks that they should find something personal for the both of them. What is something they find in themselves that makes them so good together? After dinner, Scott can be seen enjoying it with the kids as he's watching their wedding video when Natalie joins them. Of course, he doesn't know that it is her first time watching it, so she stares at it in awe as the scenes go on. The kids fall asleep, but that doesn't stop the couple from moving to the ground. Natalie apologizes for messing up lately, and he apologizes for putting pressure on her when she's stressed. "I promise to never let fear get in the way of my love for you," is what Natalie says in her vows, and curiously, she asks whether she's kept the promise. Love and fear have had their battles, but love always wins in the end, he lets her know. Tears fill her eyes as she realizes that the life that's ahead of her is nothing but perfect, and she lets Scott know that she's sure she'll be back to her normal self soon. She doesn't want to forget how a moment like they're having feels, so he helps her not to by kissing her passionately. The following morning, Abby gets to Natalie's house only to tell her that the wedding is off. There was a flood as one of the pipes busted, making the place full of water. Abby says that every venue had been already booked and that they're forced to call the wedding off, but a bright idea comes to Natalie's mind. She suggests they do it at Louis' because he loves them and they know that the food's amazing. Keeping the good news coming, Dylan's anxiety has gone away as he brings home an A+ on his test. Louis is reserved for the wedding and we can see all of the preparations for it before we officially see the bride. Natalie finds it hard not to cry since her baby sister is getting married, but Abby asks her not to. After getting ready, Natalie meets Scott, who is immediately amazed by the way she looks. "How did you know it could be like this?" she asks, and he admits to not knowing but rather hoping, as there wasn't any other person he wanted to try with. Before the wedding even begins, Mimi pulls Natalie to the side to tell her that it's time for her to go back to reality. However, she warns her that once she goes back she may not remember anything, but asks her to follow her heart as it will know for sure. Natalie is the first one to walk down the aisle as a bridesmaid, shortly followed by her daughter Emma. As Abby walks down the aisle and gets to the altar, Scott and Natalie mouth "I love you" to each other before Natalie is taken back to the present. Just as the beginning, Natalie stands in front of Mimi's mirror, but Mimi doesn't seem to remember a thing. Realizing that she could have a perfect life with Scott, Natalie decides to go after him, and Mimi reveals that Abby will be coming to take her to the airport. As Abby arrives, Natalie makes sure to apologize for not being there as much as she should be. On their way to the airport, Natalie lets her know about the proposal and how she freaked out when he asked her to marry him. But now she has the clarity she needs, and that is why she changed her mind. The traffic gets redirected and Natalie knows that they won't make it in time. She asks Abby to turn so they could go to the park, where she finds Scott sitting on a bench all alone. Surprised to see her, he asks what she's doing there, but she asks him the same thing. He admits to missing the flight because he was late, but lets her know that he has booked another one the following day. Natalie finally lets her fears aside as she asks him not to go, admitting that she's made a mistake. She can't imagine her life without him and doesn't want to. She even mentions Emma and Dylan, which only confuses him. He isn't sure how they can go back to what they were, but she promises to never let fear get between her and the love she has for him. Only wanting to let him know what she had on her mind, she stands up to leave, but he calls out her name, and as she turns he kisses her passionately. They're engaged and the wedding planning begins. Natalie sends in her application, but given the fact that she had a sneak peek into her future, she lets Scott know that she'll have her practice one day. Their engagement party comes and Natalie's father makes a toast, wishing them to have a marriage as perfect as his and her mother's. Seeing Abby's future in the room, Natalie goes up to him and advises him to go talk to her. She lets him know that Abby is smart, kind, and that she wants to be a doctor. Doing the same thing with Abby, she advises her to talk to him as she refers to him as kind, smart, and someone who loves baseball and cooking. They finally gather the courage to talk to each other, but little do they know what the future holds. Getting the crowd's attention, Scott thanks everybody for coming to their party as he claims to be the luckiest man in the world because he gets to marry the most perfect woman in the world. They both admit to only being perfect when they're with each other as they share a passionate kiss in the middle of the crowd. A beautiful ending to a perfect beginning.